peer reviews for your CV and resume. If you haven't done those, you can still talk with each other at the end of class today, but it is mostly on the honor system. I want you to be able to get some feedback from each other, so you can do that electronically, or if you send it to me, I've given feedback to people who have sent it over to me as well. But you have until Thursday morning to get those in and submitted, and that'll be the first component of your portfolio. I did a video last week on presenting a class meeting. So that is where we are picking up today with the second part of that, which is how to evaluate participation and understanding. I've mentioned at the end of that video that I wanted to make sure that whatever you present in your 75 minutes, that it engages with the class, that it isn't just something where the class is, half awake, those sorts of things. We want to make sure that it's an engaging activity. So today I was going to spend time just talking about activities and what you do that is engaging versus things that are fun, but maybe they don't work as well. For a long time, I hate to say it, the default that people did in this class for an activity was a Kahoot. Just, let's do a Kahoot, and people say, well, that's fun. The problem is I saw a large number of very mediocre Kahoots where, it was 10 questions and they were comically easy and everyone got them all right. Or it was 45 questions that people tried to jam into 10 minutes and that just never went well. So can a Kahoot be a good activity? Yeah, it can. But there are some things that I kind of wanted you to think about before you got into those things. Before we jump into what makes a good activity or how to evaluate if someone is understanding what you're talking about, are there any questions or feedback about the presentation from last week, the video, or on the CV and resume? Anything we need to talk about? Yeah. It's the same rubric that's in the back of the syllabus for all the parts of the portfolio. So it basically breaks down to half on your application to your career and half on psychological content. And for the CV and resume, since you're a psych major, there's a lot of psychological content there, and it's definitely applicable to your career. So most people get 8, 9, or 10 on it, and it really just depends on how well it communicates that information and how visually appealing it is, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's an easier assignment in here. No, you just have to have a final copy turned into me by Thursday before class. Okay.
But with my resume, I just still have, so the resume that we turn in Thursday, at the end of like education, we should have it together like as if we already graduated.
It can say graduation expected May of 2026 or anticipated. Yeah, it doesn't have to show it. You don't have to have a resume as of June 1. It can be as of today, just showing an anticipated graduation date. Right. So last week in the video that I posted, talked about how to present content and gave you some ideas on that. Today, we're talking about evaluation. You might wonder why we talk about this. At one time, I did have a requirement in here that you had to have some sort of evaluation for understanding when you presented to the class. How did they actually know what you were talking about? Did they do the reading beforehand, etc.? That got a little bit too cumbersome. But I still want to talk about this because in your careers, there often will be times when you're asked to not only present something to a group, but also to make sure that they understood what you presented. You work at a company, you are running a training of new employees, and you want to make sure that the important points they walk away with and not just that they went in one ear and out the other. Or your whole goal is to get a group talking about something and interacting. How do you do some sort of a team building activity that facilitates that versus just something that seems fun or exciting. So that's why we are talking about this today and why we're going over it. And I only have about 10 slides, and then I'll give you some time to, if you're in groups, you can talk with each other about your presentation. And if you're presenting solo, you can think about things. You can come ask me questions. So activities are great. And like I said, they definitely bring people together, but how do you know if they actually work, if they actually accomplished their goal? You know, that Kahoot that everyone enjoyed doing, if everyone got 100% on it because it was so ludicrously easy, did it really do anything other than just give people 10 minutes to have fun? And sometimes 10 minutes to have fun is what you wanted to do. You know, if you're presenting, I've taught classes that have gone, you know, my typical classes are 50 minutes or 75 minutes. My first teaching experience, I was teaching from 8 a.m. to noon or 1 o'clock. It was Saturday mornings. Those were long classes. Sometimes you needed to give breaks. Sometimes you needed to do something fun in the middle of those classes just to get people refreshed. So sometimes that is the whole goal of the activity. But more often than not, we have other goals with our activities. We have things that we would like to accomplish, and that's more or less what we're getting into today. So when thinking about evaluation, there are 4 different elements, I suppose, of assessment that we can talk about, or strategies of assessment. Assessment in the professional world gets a dirty name for itself because people think of it, they think of it as numbers, and people are always kind of scared of numbers in some cases, so they don't particularly like that you're talking about assessment. But assessment doesn't have to be numbers. It can be, it can be feedback, it can be open-ended, those sorts of things. So we'll talk about these elements, in a sense, in a moment. And if you've ever taken a class in education, some of these terms like formative versus summative will be familiar to you. If you've not taken any courses in education, then this is kind of a new idea. It is something, though, that your professors think about. You know, we talk about and think about formative versus summative. So we'll jump into that. Then we'll talk into objective versus subjective, different methodology and different feedback that we give out. So what is a formative assessment? Can anyone give me a definition of a formative assessment before even I give you anything?
I know in the schools they do they call it for a diagnostic testing
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning of the year to see what children are what level they're performing.
Yeah. So that is an example of a formative assessment. And what I just did was an example of a formative assessment, asking you if you could give an example of a formative assessment. Because what that did was it established our baseline for where we're starting from. Formative assessments are the little techniques that you use in order to understand where your audience is currently at and thinking about where you want them to be. So what I have learned from the last 35 seconds, 40 seconds, is that there's one example that we have of formative assessment. It's from the school system. That's a very common example, but that's only one example, and no one else had anything to contribute. Or what I've also learned is that maybe people are a little tired, or people are thinking, or it's taking longer for people to come up with things today. And that's giving me information not about maybe what you know, but maybe about your ability to take in information at this time. So a formative assessment is, in essence, a checkpoint so that I can get an understanding of where someone is at, where a group is at, and I can then plan based off of that. So what are some activities you could think about as you're presenting, or things that you've seen in classes that now that I've given you that bit of information, you now go, I think that was a formative assessment? Maddie Kane.
It was a Kahoot, but like we didn't know any topics, so they did that to see like where we were at, and then some
that's a formative assessment, a diagnostic test in advance. Dimanche? Yeah. So opening questions at the beginning of a lecture or a presentation, those are formative assessments that get kind of an idea of where our starting point is. What other activities or things do you see are good formative assessments? Eva? Yep. Yep. A pre and post test design, a diagnostic test design. Now, here's some other things that you might not have thought about. Worksheets are formative assessments, things that you hand out to someone and you say, here's an activity I want you to do, and then we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to collect it. I'm not going to grade it. It's formative in that the conversation we have will tell me how well prepared you are. If this activity that we did, if you found it enjoyable, if you found it useful, that is a formative assessment. I didn't have to grade it. I might grade it, or I might collect it, I might not. But a worksheet or an activity in class, a discussion in class can be a formative assessment, especially if I have people work in pairs and then share back to the group. If I have, right now we have enough in here for about 6 pairs of people. If I were to have you pair off and then I realize that only 2 out of the 6 pairs even came up with something, maybe there's more background information I have to give out, or maybe there's something that's standing in the way. Question and answer, parking lots where you have people submit questions and then you go through them at the end of class. That's a formative assessment at the beginning. So pretty much anything you are doing that you're getting feedback on, does someone know this? Do they not know it? Where are they at? That's a formative assessment. There's a lot of different ways you can do formative assessments. A summative assessment, the goal there is to evaluate learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it to some benchmark or by comparing it to previous experience that you have. So what are some summative assessments that you've seen? Yep, end of the unit quizzes. Other summative assessments are there? Ava?
So I know throughout PE course you have different sports and they go against those standards for all
Yeah, exactly. So in physical education, you've got different standards, you've got different benchmarks that people should be able to hit, and you test your students and you see where they're at with it. I was at a conference last fall where I was in a presentation on evaluating students in a phys ed class, and it was interesting to see how phys ed teachers, the ways that they would administer those assessments and get the data that they needed for each child so that they knew if that child was performing at grade level or standard level or not. Certification exams are summative assessments. Can you meet the qualifications to be certified? Well, we need to know your content knowledge. Exams in general, final exams are summative assessments. You don't have any more of the class after them, so they are the end of the line in terms of getting an assessment there. Conversations with students, if you do an oral exam or you do a presentation, all of your 75-minute presentations in here are summative assessments in a sense because you're going to give them. I'm not going to interrupt you halfway and tell you to change or do something different unless something really goes off the rails. But at the end of it, I'm going to give you a grade. And I'm going to say, yep, this was either, good, bad, whatever it might be. For your presentation, what would you see as a good mix? Formative, summative, both? What would you want to do? Yeah, perhaps a mix, maybe heavier on the formative side, but summative is definitely useful. And it's definitely helpful to know if people even heard what you were saying and knew what you were going up with. All of you are giving this 75-minute presentation once, probably. I mean, you might give it again if the topic would be useful for something else. But imagine if you were running regular trainings where you had to do the same training once a week or once a month. You'd want to have a mix of formative and summative so that you could change things in the training session in the moment, based on formative assessment and change things over time based on the evaluation your summative assessments. You go, okay, well, if we do this, exam scores are going up, so we're going to keep trying doing more of that, or we're going to change things this way or that way. So one aspect of evaluation is formative versus summative. Another aspect of evaluation is objective versus subjective. And you can mix and match these as you want. You can have summative subjective evaluations. You can have summative objective evaluations. You can have formative objective assessments and formative subjective assessments. You can kind of mix match as you like. But an objective assessment is an assessment that has a universally agreed upon right or wrong answer. So multiple choice questions, numeric answers, you either calculated it right or wrong. Close-ended, benchmarks, could you run the mile in that time? Could you get this much height on a jump? What are you actually against? Ranked scoring. So we're going to have everyone take this assessment, and then we're going to rank in order of score. These are useful in evaluating against each other. Numbers are easy. Right and wrong percentages are easy. But when you are engaged in more complex thought or more complex information, a summative assessment is not always, or an objective assessment is not always going to give you everything you need. It leaves off things. Anyone who's ever gotten an exam grade and you've thought that really doesn't show what I know or what I don't know. I got a C on this, but I thought I knew it much better, or I think that those questions were just not the right questions. Similarly, if you've given an exam to someone and everyone gets 100%, well, 100 is a number, yes, but it's not very useful. I've got issues with using that assessment. So when assessment requires a bit more nuance or a bit more, we want a subjective assessment. Now, subjective assessments mean that there aren't universal right or wrong answers. So you have to have someone or some evaluator that you trust when it comes to a subjective assessment. Essay questions, evaluating a discussion, evaluating a presentation, different rubrics that we have developed, different scoring guides, lists of behaviors. Those are all subjective because even though they might be a list or even though they might be a checklist, you still have to have some judge that is good at evaluating those things. There was a survey that came out last year, the results of which it was all about AI and higher education and how professors are using AI tools. And it was very interesting because I don't think it was a surprise to any professor that has used an AI tool, but it definitely was surprising, I think, to people outside of academia. What do you think AI tools are the worst at doing right now that a professor might use them for? Adeline. Perhaps detecting AI, yeah. Tracy? Yeah, grading. I have been playing around with AI for a while. I've run a lot of student work through AI, and what I have learned is that AI is really bad at subjective assessment. It either tells me that every paper it's gotten is the most brilliant paper that it's ever seen, and if I tell it, no, I want you to focus on these things, then all of a sudden it gets much more critical. If I give it some guidelines, it parodies my guidelines more than it will figure out. It's just not very good at subjective assessment. And it's interesting because that's the big worry that I think a lot of people have about AI with higher education. It's that all these professors are farming out their grading of student work to it. No. If you care about grading your student work, you're not getting any value out of that. What it has given me, oddly, is it's given me interesting ways to say the same thing over and over again, which I think gives a better experience for students because it doesn't mean like I'm just copying and pasting the same chunks of feedback all the time. I feel kind of bad when I do that, even though you guys might not know it because you're only seeing your feedback. You're not seeing that, a lot of people got the same feedback. So it does help in, once I've made my evaluation, it helps in me giving that evaluation. And it gives me some suggested wording and some ways to put things. I like that about it, but I wouldn't trust it to actually evaluate the essay response or to evaluate the discussion or to evaluate the presentation. It's just not a good assessor. It'd be like asking a 3-year-old, do you think that this was a good essay response? And they go, yes. Well, did you understand it? No, but I think it's good. It's there. So all subjective assessment requires that whoever's doing the assessing knows the criteria and knows how to apply it. And that can be tricky because the longer you do something, the more you will be attuned to evaluating it. We've also all had those professors and teachers and evaluators that we realize probably don't know what they should be looking for, or they're looking for the wrong things, or they're not paying attention to the things that we think they should be. So again, you mix and match. In here, when you're running your presentation, you might ask a lot of open-ended questions, which are subjectively assessed by you as people give you an answer. And you go, okay, I don't think they understand. You probably might not say this out loud, but inside in your internal dialogue, you go, oh, I don't think they got that. I think I need to give some correction on it, or I need to go over it again. One thing I think that people don't realize are that those last 3 are subjective: rubrics, scoring guides, and lists of behaviors. Because it means at the end of the day, I still have to apply, do I think you're in this category or that category? All right, so we've talked about summative versus formative. We've talked about objective versus subjective. Let's talk about the methods that we could use, things you could do. So when you want to assess, you've got the option of verbal, oral assessment, asking people questions, getting responses. Written. Applied is one that you might not have thought about, but that's simply asking someone to demonstrate a behavior. Show me how that looks, or give me an example of that. Or if I'm, say you do a whole activity on meditation, and you want to see if people are able to apply it, you could measure their heart rate and see if after they've done your meditation technique, their heart rate went down. That would be an applied method of assessing if they were able to do what you wanted them to do. Each method kind of gives you some different information on what people know, what they think they know, what they don't know, and what they should know. And some are easier or harder. So for something that is very complex and confusing, I might want to start with oral questions asking people what they know to see if they're on track. That would be a good beginning formative assessment. Then at some point, I might transition to written answers to specific questions. So it's still open-ended, but now I'm trying to get at maybe what they don't know or what specific aspects I think they should know. And then the final exam might be a summative assessment where I ask them to do something and I find out what they think they know. Are they confident in doing this? Are they able to do it? Are they able to do it at a high standard? If it's a simple task, though, if it's not complex, then a simple close-ended assessment question might work. True or false? This causes that. If they answer true or they answer false, I know very easily what my feedback would be. And sometimes you also think about the ease of use, both for the participant and the scorer. I'm going to reveal a fundamental odd truth that I didn't think I had to reveal to my colleagues, but given the number of times I've told friends that they could do this, you would have thought I blew their minds. Invariably, at the end of the semester, I have colleagues that are talking about grading end of the semester term papers and how it takes so much time and how they don't have enough time between the term paper being turned in and grades being due. And I'll hear this common complaint of, oh, they want grades due on this day. They didn't give us enough time to grade the finals, grade the exams, et cetera, et cetera. Especially with term papers, I look at them and go, well, when was the term paper due? Well, the term paper was due the Friday at the last day of class, Friday before finals week. Why didn't you make it due earlier? Well, it's a term paper. Well, yeah, but I'm not saying you have to like make it due in November or October, but instead of December 1st, maybe make it due right before Thanksgiving. Maybe make it due somewhere around there. Give yourself some more time because you need to evaluate it. So why are you forcing yourself into this problem that you're creating? Same thing with final exams. Well, I give an exam and it takes me an hour to grade each one of them. Give a different exam. Shorten it up. I had a colleague that used to give 80 question multiple choice exams. Those are grueling to take and they are annoying to grade if you grade them by hand. On a machine, you could grade them quicker, but you have to really think to yourself, in 80 questions, are you duplicating a lot of the same content? In many cases, people would say, well, yeah, well, that's great for reliability if you're testing a measure. Like if I'm developing something, then yeah, I want 5 or 6 questions asking the same thing. If I have a final exam and I just want to know if you know the topic or not, why am I asking you the same question 6 times? That doesn't seem to be fitting the purpose or fitting the goal. And when I would bring this up to people, it was almost as if they had never thought of these questions because that's just how they'd always done it. They came through with 80 question final exams, and so they assumed a final exam had to have 80 questions on it, or 100 questions, or whatever it might be. That's not a good reason. Anytime your reason comes down to, well, that's just what I've always seen, or that's what I've always done, you have to really think about these concepts again. Goal, is it serving the goal? And then the last bit that I can give you for assessment is just how to give feedback on that assessment. Rubrics and score sheets are ways to give feedback. Having meetings with people and going over things with them. Small group review, peer review. You can even give feedback based on the exact objective scoring. So I give a quiz, and anyone who got a 6 out of 10 or lower, I send a message to saying, hey, your quiz score was pretty low. Do you want to come in and chat about it? Do you want to go over it? Do you want to talk about this or that? Let me know what was unclear, etc. Or maybe I do the reverse. Anyone who got a 9 or a 10, I send a message to and say, hey, that was really great how you did on that quiz. Tell me how you studied. Tell me what you did that helped you get such a good score. And then my idea there is I can use that formative assessment of tell me more about this to help direct other students and help direct people. Or change how I teach. Maybe I'm doing something well sometimes and not so well in other situations. As triggered by time. Did it take 5 minutes for you to do the assessment? If it did, then maybe that means something different than if it took you 25 minutes. If I give you an activity in class and it takes 15 minutes for people that know it well, and someone takes 35 minutes or an hour, there's something off there. They might get the same score as the people that got it in 15 minutes, but the timing is telling me something about how some people are processing this versus others. And the best feedback is probably a combination of all these things. It's not just having one piece of the puzzle. It's having multiple pieces. Any questions about feedback, methods, objective versus subjective? So what are some ways that you could incorporate evaluation into your 75-minute presentations in here? Watch.
Have a base and then you can turn around and just like at the end of the teaching
Yeah, so have some sort of assessment at the beginning and then have something at the end. That also, if you remember the presentation I gave last week, the video, I gave a couple of example 75 minutes and it broke down, you know, you don't want to do the same thing for all 75 minutes. You don't want to stand here and just talk for 75 minutes. Unless you are a super engaging and riveting person, people will tune out after a short amount of time. So having that 10 minutes at the beginning, that's a formative assessment, and then having 10 minutes at the end, that's a summative assessment, helps break up some things. What else could you do? What are activities that you've seen in classes that you've liked that aren't lecture, that aren't presentation of material?
Go over something and explain what it is and give us time with our partner or somebody to come up with something similar, then we explain it back to you.
Yep.
You can evaluate it and get it.
Yeah, I talked about in the video last week, think, pair, share, which is a technique where you literally ask someone to do something, to think about something, answer a question, jot it down in their notebook, and then you give them a couple minutes to share with the person next to them. They pair up, and then you, after a couple minutes, have them share to the larger group. That's one way of doing a formative assessment. And if you collect it, it could be a summative assessment if you wanted to. If you were looking to, grade it on a certain way, you could decide to use that as a summative assessment. What else? Yeah. So broadly speaking, a debate or even just any kind of group activity can be a good way to get formative assessment and even a summative assessment. So putting people into groups and then as the facilitator walking around and just listening, not even interacting, but just listening to what the conversation is, tells you a lot about, was this an activity that they understood well? Was it content that they understood well? Are there further questions? Are there things that I should be doing? If you start to see things go off the rails, you can stop the whole class, bring them back together and say, let's talk a little bit more about this. Let's focus more on it. So group activities, group work can sometimes be a great way of getting information back to you on if something was effective or not. Yeah, role plays, that's a good applied assessment. They think they know how to do this. Let me see if they actually know how to do it. What else?
Because not everybody's going to be open to share like their experiences, and so we were able to tell her, give her feedback, what we learned, what we struggled with, and so when we came in for the next class, she had looked at it and she really kind of where everybody was.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I've done when I teach general psychology, anyone in here have me for general psychology? I don't think so. Not this time. When I teach general psychology, I usually do it over 50 minutes or 75 minutes. The first 10 minutes or first 5 minutes are what I call an entry ticket, where everyone comes in, they scan a QR code, or they go to the same website. It's a Google form. It's nothing too fancy. And they put down, I have a question on the screen that is something about the reading, so they're supposed to answer that question. And then the next question is, are there any topics or questions you have about the reading or the material? And so while students are doing that, I'm watching the results come in. And I can do a summative assessment on the question that was objective on there, like, what in Pavlov's example with the dogs, what was the unconditioned stimulus, and if they get that right, then I can mark it. I usually have a little color coding where I mark it green if they got it right, yellow if they got it wrong, and I can use that to give them a grade for doing the reading. And then on the other column, what's the question that you have? I can put that down. I actually have a slide in my PowerPoint that's the parking lot, which are questions that they've given me, and I put those up the very first thing. So right after that 5 minutes where they're giving me that information, I've gotten a summative assessment, whether they got the question right or wrong. I've gotten some formative assessment in the questions that they had. And it started with the same sort of consistency, and then we have a conversation about it. And then after about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we finally get into the lecture material or the presentation of content for that day. And then at the end of the class meeting, the last 5 minutes are the exit ticket. You have the entry ticket at the beginning, you have the exit ticket at the end, which is, again, 2 more questions, but one of them is, they're both formative in this case. It's what is the most useful thing you got out of this today, and what are you, how are you going to apply it? So it's a couple of questions at the end there. It's a nice way to bookend a class meeting so that there's consistency. It also helps me do some record keeping, so I can get attendance data off of that as well, because I don't put their names on it. And it also gives me a record, where if later I'm curious about, did students who did well on the exam, did they have specific questions that they were asking in those entry tickets or those exit tickets? I can look back on that. So in general, while you're doing just a 75-minute presentation in here, you don't necessarily have to think about having future information and all of that. When you get out into your careers, if you are in a role where you are presenting something once a month or once a week, you start to think about, how can I get feedback to myself, give feedback to the people I'm training, make sure that they understand what they're doing. People often ask what I'm expecting of you when you're doing an engagement in this. When I say students are engaging as part of your presentation, I'm simply asking you to provide some information to the learner and to yourself about how they're doing. I don't want anyone sitting out there listening to the topics that many of you have already told me what your topic is for your 75 minutes. I don't want them to think when they walk out of the room, do I understand this or not? They should have some feedback. Okay, I either got that or I didn't. Whether that is a summative assessment at the end, or it's a final conversation that we all have that ties it all together, or it's a role play or a skit or whatever you want to do. One question, my last little bit here that I've gotten in the past, and then I'll open it up for any questions you have, is, can I, as a part of my presentation, require students to present? So if you watched the video last week, I showed Bloom's taxonomy very briefly. Bloom's is this idea that there's 6 different levels of engagement that you can have students or participants in. So on the low end, you've got just remembering and understanding, like true, false, multiple choice questions, that sort of thing. On the high end, you have creating something, and presenting is part of that. And I've had students say, well, I'm giving a 75-minute class period, but if I wanted to have students come up and present something or do a role play or something like that, could I do that? Yeah, you could. You don't have to think that you have to be talking for 75 minutes or that you have to be physically present in the front of the room for 75 minutes. If part of what you're doing is engaging the class, that's your goal for your 75-minute class period in here. It's to facilitate more than to be on stage, in a sense. Now, for a lot of people, they will be on stage all 75 minutes because that's just how they want to set it up. But if you came in and you did a 5-minute formative assessment and then started a group activity, and then 35 minutes later, you came up, wrapped it up, and then had people present for another 25 minutes, and at the end of it, you only talked for 10 minutes. If you got everything accomplished that you wanted to do and it was engaging, then you'd score well. You don't necessarily have to put in hours and hours lecturing to get a good grade on your 75 minutes. You just have to engage the class and present the content and get an immersive experience done. What questions do you have about the 75-minute class period? Because this is the last day that we have where we are just talking about it. After today, on Thursday, we start talking. So your CV and resume is due on Thursday. On Thursday, we start talking about personal statements. And then we have a peer review on personal statements. And then we jump into the first group presentation. So we are quickly getting close to these group presentations. What questions do you have about them before I let you work on them or work on peer reviews of your CVs and resumes? You will come up with questions, I am sure. So in the remaining time we have, about a half hour, here's a few things that you can be working on. One, if you have not finished your CV and resume, then you've not gotten a peer review of it, talk to each other, have someone take a look at it, get some feedback on them. If you have, you could turn it in. It's due by Thursday at 10:50 a.m., which is when our class starts. So it has to be in before the next class period. That is 10:50 on Thursday. You could also spend the next half hour thinking about your presentation topic. If you've not met with me for your professional meeting that you're supposed to have, part of the professional activities was to have a meeting with me. You could schedule a time on my website to get on there, because I think about half of the people, I did have to cancel a few that were supposed to be last week. I think most of those people have rescheduled, but if not, you'll want to get that scheduled so that we can talk a little bit about your career goals after graduation and about your topic for 75 minutes. You could talk with your partner about 75-minute stuff. You could start looking ahead at personal statement stuff. That's what we're going to talk about on Thursday. But you've basically got a half hour. I'm available. Your partners are hopefully available. You can do peer review, get the CV and resume done, start thinking about your topic in more detail. And remember, one thing about the topics is that I do want you to try to get me something about a week in advance to give out to the class for background reading. So if you haven't started thinking about what that might be, that's another thing you could do in the next half hour. Any questions? All right, well then get to work and let me know what questions you have.